Oh, this is King Rex coming at you with a reaction video to something ugly about every president in U.S. history. I'm not going to go through all the presidents because at a certain point, I just feel this guy's video starts to go off the rails and it starts getting very political, and I want this to be more historical than political. But without further ado, we'll allow the video to start here.
George Washington was perhaps one of the least qualified presidents in American history.
That statement is completely false. First, I think really the person who made this video maybe doesn't know much more past what you would learn in a high school history book, but Washington was a member of the House of Burgesses for about 17 to 18 years. He then was a delegate to the Continental Congress. He was also president of the Constitutional Convention, so he actually was very qualified, especially for the time frame when he became president. You got to remember, a lot of the qualifications that presidents got that came after him were offices that were new when he became president. There was no House of Representatives or Senate before there was a president. That all came about at the same time. Same thing with Secretary of State, which was the main stepping stone for the presidents that were early. Like Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, John Quincy Adams, all were Secretary of State before they were president. And so was James Buchanan, but it was less common after John Quincy Adams. So you're not having those positions before that. So if you look at the qualifications Washington had compared to anyone else at the time, they were pretty good qualifications.
He grew up in a family of wealthy tobacco farmers who owned slaves, which
It's actually pretty common for the original presidents to own slaves. Of the first 18 presidents we had, 13 of them owned slaves. The ones that didn't were John Adams and John Quincy Adams, which I'm pretty sure slavery was outlawed in Massachusetts. I don't even know if it was ever legal there. Lincoln, of course, didn't own slaves. Franklin Pierce didn't. He was from New Hampshire. The New England states really didn't have much slavery other than Connecticut. And there was one other one. Millard Fillmore never owned slaves. The rest of them owned slaves at some point. Now, Grant, and that's the first 18 through Grant. The only way Grant owned slaves was that his father-in-law left him one in the will, and Grant immediately freed the slave when he could have sold the slave for a lot of money. So really, Washington, as far as it goes to, plus Washington freed his slaves upon his death. No other president did that. So other than Grant, who freed his slaves,
which he inherited and profited from. While a fine military leader, he had little in the way of political experience.
Washington was very good at rallying men. He was a very good leader of men, but as far as a military leader goes, he was, as far as a tactician and a field general, he was kind of mediocre. But the fact that he held the Continental Army together does go to his leadership. But that was kind of political because he really had to rally them the way you rally people to a political cause.
And the role of the presidency was largely shaped around his own skill set, which was mainly military, hence the title commander-in-chief.
They did make the presidency with Washington in mind, but it's just the commander-in-chief because they didn't want to put a military general, like someone that was actually still in the military, in charge of the army, so they wanted the civilian to be in charge. That would keep things like if a general was in charge of the military, you could have in charge of all the military, you could have a chance where the general just knocks over, the government takes over. So that's why.
As a war hero and founder, he was shielded from criticism during his own time and ever since.
He doesn't get a lot of criticism, but honestly, he doesn't really deserve a lot of criticism. I think Washington was the greatest president, so I think the lack of criticisms actually pretty well earned.
He failed to support Republican forces in revolutionary France.
The French Revolution was very bloody and really a pretty disgusting thing. So I think that he didn't support it because just how outlandish it was.
Responded to a handful of frontier rioters with an army of 15,000 men. And
he's talking about the Whiskey Rebellion. By going there with such force, he kept there being a real actual fight. Like if you'd have went in there with a very small force, there might have actually been an actual insurrection where they were shooting at each other. By showing so much force, he crushed it without there having to be any bloodshed or an actual force. It's actually a very smart idea to do it that way.
And his economic policies consistently favored the wealthy elites, people like himself.
His policies actually favored everybody because they made the economy good, and a good economy will help everyone. If the elite's business goes out of business, all the people that work for him lose their jobs. The idea that people getting richer at one level, taken away from people at the other level, is actually wrong. The economy grows, so if a rich person gets richer, a poor person can also get richer at the same time. It's not like one person gets rich at the expense of somebody else. Making the economy grow helps everybody.
John Adams had an obvious contempt for freedom of speech.
He did pass what was called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts are just immigration acts that you may not 100% agree with them, but they were pretty reasonable. The Sedition Act did say that you couldn't criticize the government or the president, so that was a attack on free speech. That is the biggest knock I have on John Adams.
Regularly fining or imprisoning Americans for speaking out against their government.
They really weren't widespreadly used the way that's being made. Not that many people were actually jailed under the Alien and Sedition Acts. It was wrong, but it wasn't like they were dragging hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of people off to jail, which is what you would think based on him saying regularly jailing and fining people on them.
He even arrested and imprisoned a congressman for criticizing the president in a private letter. Thomas Jefferson was one of the most successful presidents in U.S. history. He was also a major slave owner. He criticized slavery in his writing, but owned about 600 of them.
He's kind of right on Jefferson here. If you look, he has a little thing underneath every president. Some of them I don't agree with at all. But he was a hypocritical slave owner. But the thing is, slavery was the norm.
And when a slave rebellion threw off French colonial rule in Haiti, Jefferson's response was to embargo that country.
It should be noted that the embargo Jefferson passed actually was an embargo on every country, not just Haiti. It was a response to Britain and France basically seizing ships and stuff like that. So the embargo was every country, not just Haiti. And Jefferson did favor France a lot. So the fact that he would have favored France in this situation because Haiti was a French colony, and nobody really wanted to, the whole world kind of treated Haiti that way, not just the United States.
To embargo that country. While Haiti's capital of Port-au-Prince was once known as the Paris of the New World, the country fell into deep poverty as a result of Jefferson's embargo, and today remains one of the poorest countries in the world.
This is really a weird take. I think this is the problem with people thinking of the United States as it is today and not realizing how the United States was at the time. The United States having an embargo on Haiti would not force that country into poverty. The United States was not the economic powerhouse in the early 1800s that it is today. Plus, the United States really was a country that did a lot of exporting of raw materials. Most of the imports from the United States were finished goods. So really, there's not much that would have came out of Haiti into the United States to help the Haitian economy anyway. You got to remember, we had our own sugar coming from Louisiana at the time, and any cotton and stuff like that. We had those types of goods were already made in the United States. So the United States did not kill Haiti's economy, and plus, how could Jefferson's embargo be so long-lasting that you're looking 200 years later, it's still affecting their economy? Over 200 years. That's just hyperbole on the part of the guy making the video.
James Madison did not adequately prepare the military for the War of 1812, even though he was the guy who pushed for it, which is why the war is also known as Madison's War. The war accomplished little for the United States, but provided Britain.
This is actually, some of this is true, some of this is false. The United States wasn't as prepared as they could be, but a big part of the reason why the United States wasn't as prepared was because Jefferson did a lot of things that made the military less prepared. He cut down on the amount of standing army that the United States had, and he changed the way the military was building ships. They were building what were called frigates, which were ships that could do battle with Britain. He changed it to what were called gunboats, which people called the Mosquito Fleet, which was good when you were fighting the Barbary pirates out in Africa because they didn't have any big ships, but they really couldn't stand a chance against Britain or France's navy. Now, as far as the nothing getting accomplished in the War of 1812, that's patently false. The biggest reasons for the War of 1812 was Britain was searching and seizing U.S. ships, taking sailors off the ships and forcing them into the British Navy. And they were also inciting and arming Indians, creating Indian rebellions. After the War of 1812, all three of these things stopped. Britain no longer impressed U.S. sailors into their military. They quit arming and inciting Indian rebellions, and they didn't search and seize ships until World War I, when Wilson basically let them get away with it, when they stopped all traffic into the North Sea, and France did the same thing into the Mediterranean. So realistically, the war actually accomplished all of its war aims. So this is not true. I mean, it was a successful war if you look at war as a means to an end. The problem is that when people look at war, they see the victories the United States had in other wars, like the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, the First Iraq War, even the World Wars, where it was a clear victory. And this war was kind of a draw because it was a negotiated peace, so they don't look at it as being successful when it did accomplish all the war aims, so it was a successful war.
States, but provided British forces the opportunity to occupy Washington and set both the Capitol building and the White House on fire.
I mean, it's true that the British did occupy Washington, D.C., but Britain was the biggest threat we ever fought in a war. Germany, as far as the threat to us from basically how they could come over here and the strength of Britain compared to the strength of us. During both World Wars, Germany was never a threat to get to the continental U.S. Japan was never a threat to get to the continental U.S. in World War II. I mean, Mexico, we pretty much beat them in every single battle. Spain was quickly defeated in the Spanish-American War. I mean, Iraq had there was really no other enemy we ever fought that actually served a threat to the United States that Great Britain did in the War of 1812. So, I mean, you got to look at it in perspective.
James Monroe got very little done considering the fact that his only opposition, the Federalist Party, was already fading away by the time of his presidency.
Actually, this is false. Number one, you have to look at the fact. This is another thing. This is why I think the guy's looking at all this stuff through the lens of someone in whenever he made the video, 2021 or 2022. I can check here real quick. I guess it's 2017, but still. Monroe did quite a bit. He passed the first internal improvement laws, which are laws in which the government builds things like roads, bridges, and stuff like that. He got the Missouri Compromise passed, the Monroe Doctrine, tariff reform. He acquired Florida from Spain. He got the Rush-Bagot Treaty signed. He got the Russo-American Treaty signed. So he actually did quite a bit as president for someone that served at the time he served. I mean, we didn't have an activist government in the early 1800s. In fact, James Monroe was part of the Jeffersonian Republicans, and Jefferson said the government that governs best is the government that governs least. So there wasn't, aggressive government at the time like there is today as far as doing a lot. I mean, it's the way it was. So when he served, he did quite a bit.
His solution for the slavery issue was the Missouri Compromise, which drew a line between free and slave states. He claimed that the compromise had saved the Union, but in reality, he was just setting the stage for the Civil War.
I think first, there's some truth there that he did kind of kick the issue down the road, but that really was the way that it was done when the Constitution was written. Even when the United States first came together under the Articles of Confederation, it really was a compromise between states that had slavery and states that either didn't have slavery or were on the way of getting rid of slavery. They had to make this compromise to hold the colonies and states together, and the idea was to allow the southern states to peaceably abolish slavery on their own. Now, he did kick the can down the road, but you can make the argument for every president who served before Abraham Lincoln. The Missouri Compromise did work until the Mexican-American War brought a whole bunch of new territory into the country, and that new territory is what re-sparked the slavery issue. So he really did. The slavery issue was not a big issue for a few decades because of the Missouri Compromise. Plus, it was a big win for anti-slavery forces because it forbade slavery in most of the Louisiana territory. The only places that allowed it was in Missouri, Louisiana, which was already a state. Missouri was already ready for statehood and they had slaves. Arkansas and what became Oklahoma, but basically becomes Indian territory, so slavery wasn't allowed there either, really. And the rest of that area there, from when you're counting the Dakotas, Kansas, Nebraska, Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, all those states had slavery barred in them because of the Missouri Compromise. So it's actually not as bad as it's made out to be by this guy.
As Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams authored the Monroe Doctrine, claiming all of North and South America to be part of the sphere of influence of the United States.
That is that's completely wrong. That's not how the Monroe Doctrine was written. Plus, he didn't do it as president, which to me, great presidents and what they did as president, although some of the stuff he's going here doesn't. The Monroe Doctrine was good. It was later perverted by other presidents, but it was decades later. The first president to really start changing the meaning of the Monroe Doctrine was Grover Cleveland in the 1880s. The Monroe Doctrine was written in the 1820s. So you're talking like 60 plus years. So I think the Monroe Doctrine might have been around 1820. It basically told Europe that they were not allowed to come into the Americas and establish new colonies or take back control of their old colonies, because a whole bunch of Spanish colonies had became free countries. Plus, the Monroe Doctrine, one thing he complained about was the slavery vote in Haiti. Well, the Monroe Doctrine kind of protects Haiti from someone coming back in and taking Haiti back over.
While you may have seen it as a measure against colonialism at the time, it was soon to be used as a rationale for near constant intervention in Latin American politics, including the overthrow of even democratically elected governments.
Like I said, soon to be 60 plus years is not soon to be. And most of those democratically elected governments really weren't democratic. They're generally communist governments, which are run by dictators.
Andrew Jackson forcibly removed tens of thousands of Native Americans from their homes. Those who resisted were met with hostility, resulting in slaughter and the Second Seminole War.
This is true, but I mean, he's gone way more in depth than all the presidents before Andrew Jackson. Not only did he forcibly remove the Native Americans, he actually did it against a ruling of the Supreme Court, which was illegal. He illegally removed the deposits from the Second Bank of the United States of America. Even if he didn't like the bank, he still broke the Constitution by illegally removing those deposits because it was passed as an act of Congress that they had to be there. And he allowed his Postmaster General to burn anti-slavery mailings, which basically were they'd be like newspapers sent to people in the South, just trying to convince them to get rid of their slaves and abolish slavery. So it wasn't like it wasn't attacking those people. It was trying to basically convince them that slavery was wrong. You should free your slaves. So he did a lot of bad things. He wrecked the economy on his way out. The Second Seminole War was the costliest and deadliest Indian war in the history of the United States. Which, when you add it to his, I don't know if it's cultural genocide and forced evictions. I would term it ethnic cleansing, because basically he pushed all the Native Americans in North America far beyond the Mississippi River. He resettled them in Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. So any Native Americans that were east of those areas were pushed that far out. And remember, the United States didn't have the Southwest or Texas at the time, so that pretty much was the frontier.
Martin Van Buren's incompetence is widely credited for the economic depression following the Panic of 1837.
This is another quick one. It is true that he he didn't cause the economic disaster. The economic disaster was caused by Jackson, and he just did a very poor job of um, dealing with it, which made it last longer. He does have some kind of funny things. Inspired gang in Seinfeld universe, because there was a gang called the Van Buren Gang on Seinfeld, if you ever watched it. But he didn't cause the economic disaster. He just made it worse. To be fair to him, and I don't think he's a good president, but we should be fair and say that it was just. And there's other bad things he did, like he was very pro-slavery. He was in favor of the gag rule, which said that anti-slavery petitions could not be brought in front of the House of Representatives. He also favored, if you know about the Amistad case, he basically favored taking the men who were illegally kidnapped from Africa and forcing them into slavery on the Amistad, which was a ship. He also kicked the can down the road on the Carolina Affair, the Aroostook War, and the Texas question. So he really was bad in a lot more ways. They kind of gloss over some of these really bad Democrats on here, just quickly get past them without saying very much.
Following the Panic of 1837, William Henry Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in American history on a cold, rainy day, wearing no coat or hat, and rode in on horseback rather than a closed carriage. The oldest president ever elected at the time, he promptly caught pneumonia and died.
People aren't sure exactly how he died. Well, I tried to go back just enough to show this. It says, forgot his coat, died like a total idiot. I don't like the whole died like a total idiot. It is possible that he got sick from that, or it's possible he actually got sick in another way and died. He did die very soon after becoming president. He was president for a month.
Died. John Tyler was never elected president and seemed to have a great deal of disdain for democracy.
I've never heard anything that states that John Tyler had any disdain for democracy. I don't know where that idea actually comes from. Like some of the stuff this guy says seems like it comes out of a alternate universe.
He was nearly impeached after vetoing absurd numbers of bills and
he was impeached, but not about vetoing absurd numbers of bills. He vetoed 10 bills, which might have been a little high at the time, but Andrew Jackson vetoed 12 bills. I'll let this guy actually re-say this part, because I kind of cut him off sooner than I should have.
Nearly impeached after vetoing absurd numbers of bills in defiance of the custom that presidents should only veto what they deem unconstitutional.
The unconstitutional part, the president that started vetoing bills based on more than whether they thought they were constitutional or unconstitutional was actually Andrew Jackson, who vetoed more bills than John Tyler. John Tyler vetoed 10 bills. 2 times they tried to renew the Second Bank of the United States of America. He vetoed it both times. And he did veto that because he felt that it was unconstitutional. You can argue whether he was right or wrong about his thought process there, but he thought it was unconstitutional. He also vetoed 2 tariff bills because it was going to raise tariffs as a way of closing the budget deficit, which was a good thing, but the government was also selling public lands and taking the money from selling public lands and distributing it back to the states, and said that he wouldn't raise the tariff unless they ended that distribution, because they should use that money along with an increased tariff to close the deficit. And the impeachment on John Tyler was completely and totally political. It didn't even come close to passing. It is not against the Constitution for a president to veto bills. So basically, it was probably the most political impeachment attempt in the history of the country, which is why it failed. So yeah, Tyler. So the stuff he's saying about Tyler just simply isn't true. It's not a. And Grover Cleveland vetoed over 500 bills in his 2 terms as president. So when you figure 10's a normal amount compared to 500, not that much longer. I mean, that was closer than the his changing the Monroe Doctrine.
He then focused on annexing the Republic of Texas, which a decade prior was officially part of Mexican territory. Polk completed the annexation of Texas, thereby completing the theft of Mexican land, which triggered the Mexican-American War.
Now, if you listen to these 2 statements back to back, he's literally contradicting himself. He admitted under the Tyler one that it was no longer Mexican territory because it was Mexican territory a decade before Tyler started trying to annex it. But then when Polk finished the annexation, which actually the bill passed for the annexation under Tyler, but there was still some formalities that needed to be finished, and he called it the theft of Mexican land. Texas became an independent country in, I believe, 1836, and it immediately tried to be annexed by the United States. Polk basically worked on getting that done. Tyler did, and Polk finished it up. But Texas was no longer part of Mexico. I mean, that'd be like saying if a country bought a parcel of territory that was owned by some other country years and years later, that it was theft from that country. It was not theft of Mexican territory. And the reason why the Mexican-American War happened was because Polk basically incited war because he wanted to buy California, and Mexico did not want to sell California. That's what caused the Mexican-American War, not the annexation of Texas.
1848. He was an aggressive expansionist, not just of U.S. territory, but also of presidential powers. Like George...
He really didn't actually he didn't steal Mexican land. He did trigger war, though. He didn't actually expand the power of the presidency that much. Jackson really did a lot. He was the president that really expanded the power, and actually kind of went away a little bit after. A lot of people left the Democratic Party because Jackson expanded the power of the presidency so much, and they felt he was a tyrant, including John Tyler left for that reason, which is why Tyler vetoed a lot of bills that the Whigs passed, because at heart he was a Democrat. He just couldn't go along with Andrew Jackson.
Presidential powers. Like George Washington, Zachary Taylor had military experience but no political experience before becoming president.
It is true he had zero political experience, but he was a great general, and he actually wasn't that bad as president.
As such, he accomplished little, aside from being the last president to own slaves.
He's the last person who owned slaves while he was president. Like I said, presidents after him did own slaves. Grant was inherited one that he sold. Andrew Johnson owned slaves, and so did James Buchanan, and they both bought those slaves and acquired them. He did accomplish the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, which was a treaty with Britain about the possibility of a future canal across basically what became the Panama Canal, which is across Central America. So he wasn't like a total do-nothing president. And also the Department of Interior was first set up while he was president. But he only served 16 months. And once again, this isn't a time when the federal government was very activist, and most of his term of presidency was basically, what do we do with all the territory we got from Mexico? And it never got settled while he was president.
Millard Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law, which required citizens of free states to return escaped slaves to their masters.
He did sign the Fugitive Slave Act as part of the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 had 5 parts to it, one of which was the Fugitive Slave Act. The other 4 parts all favored the North. The Fugitive Slave Act favored the South. Plus, it didn't require U.S. citizens to return slaves. It actually had U.S. Marshals get their slaves back. The previous Fugitive Slave Act, which the Fugitive Slave Act is required by the Constitution, that fugitive slaves are returned to their owners. It's actually in the Constitution. If you have a full version of the Constitution, you'll see it there. But basically, it didn't require citizens to return the slaves. It was marshals, but there were fines if you basically were hiding slaves. But there were fines in the original Fugitive Slave Act from the 1890s. So, I mean, he did sign that. I do think he gets the requirement was marshals, not U.S. citizens.
He also joined the deeply anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant Know Nothing Party.
What had happened was he was on vacation in Europe at the time, and what was after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, most people that were Northern Whigs formed the Republican Party, but there were still some Whigs left that didn't join the Republicans or the Democrats. They nominated Fillmore for president, but also the Know Nothing Party, which was an anti-immigrant party, they also nominated Fillmore for president. So he basically just ran with both nominations, but he ran basically as a president to hold the Union together. He didn't run on the racist portions of the Know Nothing Party. So he really, there's no proof that he actually backed any of the Know Nothing stuff.
Franklin Pierce broke with Monroe's Missouri Compromise to support the even more controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act basically said that basically Kansas and Nebraska were territories in from the Louisiana Purchase, where slavery was barred. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was brought to him by Stephen Douglas, basically said that those territories could decide for themselves if they wanted to have slavery. Well, the Southerners thought that it was a 50-50 compromise. They would get Kansas as a slave state, and Nebraska would be a free state. People in the North did not want slavery to extend any further than it already was, so they were against either one of those becoming a slave state, which led to the formation of the Republican Party, which fractured parties on sectional lines and also led to bleeding Kansas. Really, that act sunk his presidency. He is a very tragic character, but yeah, that act just kind of destroyed him. It did expand slavery, and that is true.
Which allowed for the expansion of slavery into the West. He also tried but failed to annex Cuba. James Buchanan was a doughface.
It is true that James Buchanan was a doughface, but so was Van Buren and Pierce. All three of those guys were Northern Democrats that basically favored slavery.
A Northerner with Southern sympathies. Toward the end of his presidency, many of the states that would become the Confederacy seceded from the Union.
It is true that that's happened. Like, he really didn't do anything as states started seceding from the Union. He also was really bad in a lot of other ways. He failed during the Panic of 1837 in much the same way that Van Buren did in 1837. He's a really bad president. I think just calling him a doughface and saying states started seceding is kind of being nice to him as far as bad as he was.
The Confederacy seceded from the Union. While credited with freeing the slaves, that oversimplification ignores the role of abolitionist groups such as the Quakers and the very real role blacks had in emancipating themselves.
This is actually kind of a way of trying to diminish Lincoln. That's really not fair. Any major thing that a president passes generally will have support from people within the country that were for that idea. Not to be mean, but blacks really didn't do a lot to free themselves other than the few that were runaway slaves. Abolitionists didn't do much to free slaves either. Lincoln was the catalyst. He actually ended slavery. It would have eventually happened, but it would have been a lot longer, especially because the Deep South was making a lot of money. So basically, if you say something like this, you can basically diminish anyone's accomplishment as president by saying, well, there's other people that favored that too. So I think that's really not if that's the worst thing you can think about, overpraised reluctant emancipator. Lincoln wanted to hold the Union together, but he did want to end slavery, which is why he didn't want slavery extending any further than where it already was.
Lincoln repeatedly said he believed in white supremacy and early on in the war didn't allow his generals to free slaves in captured territories. In point of fact, he didn't believe that freed slaves could or should one day become full American citizens.
I've never seen anything where he said slaves shouldn't become full American citizens. He pressed for and got the 13th Amendment passed, because had he not pressed for that amendment being passed, and the movie Abraham Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis in it is mostly true. There's very little that's false in there. He does cajole a lot of people into voting for and passing the 13th Amendment in Congress, which is really a hard thing to do. And the fact is that Lincoln thought the war would be quick, and he didn't want there to be hard feelings. He wanted there to be a quick war and for the southern states to come back in. So he wanted the military to tread very lightly on the citizens, which is why he didn't want them going around freeing a bunch of slaves.
Andrew Johnson opposed federally guaranteed rights for African Americans.
That really is quite a simplification on Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson undermined Reconstruction, which caused it to fail, and that hurt African Americans for over 100 years. Now remember, his undermining of Reconstruction was about 100 years before the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He came in 1865 and immediately started undermining Reconstruction. So yeah, he was a lot. Like I said, really quickly gloss over him after they spend time on Lincoln, who was a good president. Johnson just kind of it's like they want to forget about that Johnson existed.
Ulysses S. Grant was a great general, but not a great president. He ushered in the Gilded Age, and his close associates were constantly steeped in scandal.
The scandals are really over exaggerated under Grant's. A lot of the scandals that came to light during Grant's term were scandals that transpired before he was president or started long before he was president. The creation of the spoil system under Andrew Jackson led to corruption in pretty much every part of the federal government. If you look at some of the biggest scandals, the biggest one's the Credit Millard scandal, which happened when Andrew Johnson was president. It was found out about under Grant, and they prosecuted people while Grant was president. The Tweed ring was New York City politics. It was prosecuted while Grant was president. Did not involve any part of the federal government. The whiskey ring dated back a long time. It was basically broken up under Grant. He's basically the customs houses under Grant were much cleaner than they were before. He eliminated scandals, any type of corruption within the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The one person he put in office that was guilty of scandal was his Secretary of War Belknap, and he basically had dismissed him when he found out about the scandal. So Grant was really actually did a lot to end corruption, but he gets charged with creating it.
Scandal. Hayes pushed for the assimilation of Native Americans into white culture.
Almost every president did that. It really wasn't in vogue to allow natives to keep their native culture for a very long time after Hayes. Even up to Franklin Roosevelt, they were trying to, I think, assimilate Native Americans into American culture. I think it's actually Nixon was the first president to really allow them to keep their tribal culture and not try to assimilate them. So that's really a charge you could put on just about everybody.
Crushed a railroad strike with federal troops. And
he did crush a railroad strike with federal troops, but that's really an oversimplification of what actually happens. There were massive riots. The governors asked him to do something about it, and he sent the troops in to protect federal property. They did stop the strike without any bloodshed. Now, there was some bloodshed in the strikes between state militias and strikers, but the federal troops, there was no bloodshed there, and it was being a pretty violent strike, and the governors were asking for help, so he kind of did the right thing.
Troops. And despite serving as president, no one today knows who the hell this guy is. Like William.
Well, first off, not 100% true. People do know who he is. A lot of people don't, but I actually did I used to train people where I worked, and I'd actually have them write down all the presidents they can remember. Most people can only remember the presidents from their lifetime, and a few of the major ones like Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and the Roosevelts, and they really don't remember anyone else. Most people don't remember Woodrow Wilson, who was, you could argue, is the most consequential president ever. Most of them don't remember Andrew Jackson, who's actually on the $20 bill. It's a bigger indictment of the American people that they don't remember Hayes more than that Hayes is not remembered. I mean, that's not his fault. He's not remembered.
This guy is. Like William Henry Harrison, Garfield died before getting much of anything done.
This is a play on Garfield the Cat Hated Mondays. That's actually somewhat humorous.
Chester A. Arthur was widely admired by contemporaries like Mark Twain, but has been largely forgotten over time, possibly because he never achieved anything of note.
That's actually false. He got the Pendleton Civil Service Act passed, which really was a huge deal at the time. Basically, it ended the spoil system, which was so ingrained within the federal government. It was hard to believe that such a thing could be passed. He also massively paid down the debt while president as well, and he started the building the first more modernized Navy. Most of the U.S. Navy at the time was wooden ships. He started building the first metal or iron ships in the Navy. There were a few like boats like the Monitor and the Merrimack, but those weren't really ocean-faring vessels. So modernizing the Navy and passing that Pendleton Act and running a fairly good surplus are all things that he did. There's a reason why most people actually think he's a pretty decent president that know him.
Grover Cleveland oversaw a suffering economy and cracked down on unions.
Another really quick one that they jumped through pretty quickly here, Grover Cleveland. Now, when he cracked down on the unions, he actually favored the guy he hired as his attorney general was basically a lawyer for the railroads before he became attorney general. He favored the exploitive Pullman company that basically, if you worked for the Pullman company, you were forced to live in what was called a Pullman town, which means you rented your house from Pullman, you had to shop in Pullman stores, which he made money. Basically, any money you made went right back to him from you renting a house from him and buying goods in his stores. And when the strike started was when he lowered wages, but he didn't lower prices in his stores or on his rentals. It was pretty much an exploitive company, and he came in there. The governors told him not to come in with the military, and he did. And he used it to crush the strike. The economy was made worse by his thing, and he was really inspired, annoyingly Sesame Street character because of Grover. He was really a very racist president. It was against women's suffrage. Passed a law called the Dawes Act that took away 2/3 of what remained of Native American lands in the country at that time. And this is in the 1880s. He stripped away a lot of the protections African Americans still had in the South, which helped lead to the rise of Jim Crow laws. He was really a pretty poor president.
On unions. Benjamin Harrison was notorious for wasting government funds.
Tax the rich to murder the poor. I don't even understand what that means, but he's generally people do accuse Benjamin Harrison of being a wasteful spender, which is kind of funny because Benjamin Harrison ran a net surplus during his term in office, meaning that the federal government owed less money when he left office than when he entered. And only two presidents since then have done that, Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. So he really wasn't a wasteful spender that he's made out to be.
His policies toward Native Americans were hostile to say the least. He oversaw the bloody Battle of Wounded Knee against the Sioux and tried to annex Hawaii.
Okay, this is one thing that a lot of people do, and I think that they're kind of wrong on it. Wounded Knee was bad, but Wounded Knee was one in a long series of such actions that happened. It wasn't like Wounded Knee was this isolated incident and nothing like it ever happened. This was pretty commonplace. And a big part of the reason why is because a lot of the Native American tribes would actually do the same thing. If they didn't take prisoners, Native American tribes didn't, they would generally kill everyone. They didn't believe in taking prisoners, and I think that's part of. It's not an excuse, but I think it was kind of became a tit for tat thing with the Native Americans. They didn't. You massacre our people, we massacre your people. So I'm saying it's not an excuse for it, but plus Benjamin Harrison wasn't sitting around the battlefield overseeing these guys do what they were doing. It was the leaders in the field. And actually, Wounded Knee was one of the very last actions in all the Indian Wars. There was, I think, maybe a few things in Grover, because Grover Cleveland had a term before and a term after Harrison. I think he may have had a few things happen after that, and there might have been some, but it was pretty much the last major Indian battle. So I think Wounded Knee was basically people overemphasize it as a way of vilifying Harrison, but it was not like it was an isolated incident. And he did a lot of good things too. Like he actually, even though Arthur started building some modern ships, he basically rebuilt the entire Navy into a first-class Navy. He passed the Land Revision Act, which allowed for the creation of federal parks. There was Grant did create Yellowstone Park, but it was very hard to do federal parks before the Land Revision Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act allowed for the breaking up of trust. So the guy did a lot of positive things. I'm going to end this video here and do a part 2. So you can look for that. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, and have a great day.